Freedom is expensive, but dependence has cost us more. 6 decades ago, Martin Luther King Jr. declared that freedom is never given voluntarily by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. His words, once shouted from church steps in Alabama, now echo across a very different soil, the red earth of Africa. But this time, the battleground is not cotton fields or courtrooms. It is cables. It is servers. It is sovereignty. Digital. Visible. Unstoppable. Imagine a continent of 1.4 billion people, long stranded on the toll roads of Silicon Valley, suddenly flipping the switch. No more routing through Europe. No more silent surveillance. No more voices buried under algorithms designed elsewhere. A digital revolution begins. Not in a garage in California, but in Ouagadougou. Led not by a billionaire in a hoodie, but by a soldier in uniform, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Stay with us. This isn't just another story. It's a signal, a blueprint, a turning point. Subscribe and be part of it. Because if one small landlocked nation can reclaim its data, its voice, and its dignity, then what's stopping the rest of the world? Before there was a revolution, there was a problem. A quiet, grinding injustice buried in the code and cables of the modern world. For decades, Africa's digital life was shaped not by proximity, but by distance. Every email from Ghana, every search from Nairobi, every payment from Dakar was routed through servers in Europe or the United States. A student in Ouagadougou emailing her teacher had her message travel thousands of miles before returning next door. This was not technology. It was control disguised as convenience. They called it a global internet. But for Africa, it was a rented network. And rent, as always, was costly. Africa paid some of the highest internet prices on Earth, not due to lack of infrastructure, but because that infrastructure belonged elsewhere. The fiber ran under oceans. The servers sat in Silicon Valley. The algorithms were tuned in London, not Lagos. For families in Burkina Faso, access to online school meant sacrificing food. For journalists, it meant choosing between truth and censorship. For entrepreneurs, it meant waiting. Waiting for approvals, payments, visibility. And yet, in boardrooms in California, this system was praised as efficient. It was not efficient. It was extractive. It mirrored the old colonial pattern. Resources flowed out, and dependency flowed in. This was not a digital highway. It was a toll road with foreign gatekeepers, and Africa had no keys. Then came a voice. Young, firm, and unyielding. Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, did not speak in the usual terms. He did not call for better contracts. He called for something far deeper. Digital sovereignty. Not just owning the tools, but controlling the roads that knowledge, money, and culture traveled upon. From gold beneath our feet to data above our heads, he said in late 2022. Nothing truly belongs to us unless we build it ourselves. It was not a threat. It was a plan. The African internet infrastructure, long fragmented and foreign-controlled, needed not reform but reinvention. Traoré's vision was not to ask permission, but to lay cables, build hubs, and write protocols incompatible with Silicon Valley's dominance. A continental internet exchange, served by Africans, for Africans. Not a copy of the old internet, but a new one, rooted in African languages, serving African priorities. He was not alone. Engineers from Addis Ababa to Abidjan joined the movement. Policymakers across the African Union endorsed the blueprint. Technicians began laying over 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic cables, threading deserts, jungles, and cities. 47 data centers rose like monuments, not to power, but to possibility. And for the first time, African developers were asked to build, not for others, but for themselves. It was more than a technical project. It was a statement that Africa would no longer be a tenant in the house of data, that it would be the architect, the owner, The Guardian. Skeptics laughed. Western media labeled the project symbolic. Analysts called it impractical, too expensive. A dream. But something unusual was happening. The dream was spreading. From youth groups in Bamako to coding clubs in Kigali, the project sparked more than headlines. It ignited belief, not just in technology, but in the idea that Africa could stop renting its future. Teachers began preparing digital lessons for local servers. App developers rewrote code in native languages. Civil society mapped out plans for digital rights frameworks rooted in transparency, not surveillance. And then came the moment. The cables were in place. The servers were humming. The protocols, untouchable by Google's crawlers, were tested in live. The silence before the switch was not hesitation. It was breath. A collective inhale before a generation made its leap. Because what happens when a continent no longer asks to connect, but builds its own connection? That was the question, and the world was about to find out. Before there was a revolution, there was a problem. A quiet, grinding injustice buried in the code and cables of the modern world. For decades, Africa's digital life was shaped not by proximity, but by distance. Every email from Ghana, every search from Nairobi, every payment from Dakar was routed through servers in Europe or the United States. A student in Ouagadougou emailing her teacher had her message travel thousands of miles before returning next door. This was not technology. It was control, disguised as convenience. They called it a global internet, but for Africa, it was a rented network. And rent, as always, was costly. Africa paid some of the highest internet prices on Earth, not due to lack of infrastructure, but because that infrastructure belonged elsewhere. The fiber ran under oceans. The servers sat in Silicon Valley. The algorithms were tuned in London, not Lagos. For families in Burkina Faso, access to online school meant sacrificing food. For journalists, it meant choosing between truth and censorship. For entrepreneurs, it meant waiting. Waiting for approvals, payments, visibility. And yet, in boardrooms in California, this system was praised as efficient. It was not efficient. It was extractive. It mirrored the old colonial pattern. Resources flowed out, and dependency flowed in. This was not a digital highway. It was a toll road with foreign gatekeepers, and Africa had no keys. Then came a voice, young, firm, and unyielding. Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, did not speak in the usual terms. He did not call for better contracts. He called for something far deeper. Digital sovereignty, not just owning the tools, but controlling the roads that knowledge, money, and culture traveled upon. From gold beneath our feet to data above our heads, he said in late 2022, nothing truly belongs to us unless we build it ourselves. It was not a threat. It was a plan. The African internet infrastructure, long fragmented and foreign-controlled, needed not reform, but reinvention. Traoré's vision was not to ask permission, but to lay cables, build hubs, and write protocols incompatible with Silicon Valley's dominance. A continental internet exchange, inserted by Africans, for Africans. Not a copy of the old internet, but a new one, rooted in African languages, serving African priorities. He was not alone. Engineers from Addis Ababa to Abidjan joined the movement. Policymakers across the African Union endorsed the blueprint. Technicians began laying over 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic cables, threading deserts, jungles, and cities. 47 data centers rose like monuments, not to power, but to possibility. And for the first time, African developers were asked to build not for others, but for themselves. It was more than a technical project. It was a statement that Africa would no longer be a tenant in the house of data, that it would be the architect, the owner. The Guardian. Skeptics laughed. Western media labeled the project symbolic. Analysts called it impractical, too expensive, a dream. But something unusual was happening. The dream was spreading. From youth groups in Bamako to coding clubs in Kigali, The project sparked more than headlines. It ignited belief, not just in technology, but in the idea that Africa could stop renting its future. Teachers began preparing digital lessons for local servers. App developers rewrote code in native languages. Civil society mapped out plans for digital rights frameworks rooted in transparency, not surveillance. Even farmers began to imagine apps tailored to their weather, their markets, their needs. Not general tools adapted from distant cities, but digital seeds grown in African soil. Governments, too, saw opportunity. No longer would security data be stored in unknown foreign clouds. No longer would elections be filtered through platforms whose priorities were profit, not people. The shift was structural, philosophical, and deeply personal. For millions who had never felt seen online, the idea of an African internet was not just political, it was spiritual. A way to reclaim the mirror. And then came the moment. The cables were in place. The servers were humming. The protocols untouchable by Google's crawlers were tested and live. The silence before the switch was not hesitation. It was breath. A collective inhale before a generation made its leap. Because what happens when a continent no longer asks to connect, but builds its own connection? That was the question, and the world was about to find out. The world did not blink when the cables were laid. It did not flinch when the data centers rose. But when Africa flipped the switch, something happened. Something no one could ignore. Within 72 hours, over 200 million users migrated to the new system. No internet platform in history, not Facebook, not TikTok, not WhatsApp, had ever seen adoption on this scale, in this time, by this many. It was not a slow transition. It was a rupture. Google's crawlers couldn't index it. Microsoft's cloud couldn't penetrate it. The architecture was incompatible by design. Built on African protocols, optimized for African languages, and routed entirely through African infrastructure. It wasn't just a new network. It was an act of digital self-determination. In Silicon Valley, emergency meetings were convened behind closed doors. Executives scrambled to understand how a continent they had long considered a passive market had become an assertive architect. Reports emerged of frantic lobbying efforts, emails to embassies, calls to regulators, op-eds in international papers questioning the legality and stability of this continental divergence. Some framed it as fragmentation. Others used words like reckless, unilateral, even destabilizing. But beneath the diplomatic language was a deeper fear that the monopoly had cracked. And if Africa could walk out, who might follow? In Washington, think tanks debated whether this was a geopolitical signal. In Paris and Brussels, officials quietly expressed concern over losing cultural influence in Francophone regions. In London, headlines spoke of a splintered internet, as if a sovereign choice made by African nations was an existential threat to the world order. But on the streets of Accra, in the markets of Kigali, in the classrooms of Lusaka, the story sounded very different. To ordinary people, it was not fragmentation. It was liberation. Students streamed lectures without buffering. Farmers used local apps to predict rainfall and set fair prices. Small businesses processed payments directly, without fees leaking out to third-party platforms. In rural clinics, doctors accessed cloud-based patient records without relying on foreign servers. In newsrooms, journalists searched in their own languages and found local sources ranked first, not buried behind Western narratives. For them, the change wasn't abstract. It was real. And it was overdue. In Ouagadougou, murals appeared overnight. Bold paint on concrete walls reading, "Our code, our rules." In Nairobi, youth collectives created viral music videos celebrating the switch beats mixed with voiceovers of Traore's speeches. In Johannesburg, civil society groups held forums to ensure that digital freedom would be matched by digital rights. And yet, this euphoria walked hand in hand with tension. Inside Africa, debates ignited. Could the infrastructure handle billions of requests daily? Would governments respect online privacy? or abuse new control. Was sovereignty sustainable without transparency? These were not signs of failure. They were signs of maturity. Because real independence, is never clean. It is messy, layered, and full of competing visions. What mattered now was not perfection, but commitment. Meanwhile, international media tried to reframe the narrative. Instead of highlighting the grassroots energy behind the switch, some reports focused on potential security risks. Others questioned Africa's readiness to manage such a complex system, but their concern rang hollow. For decades, the old system failed Africa. Slow, expensive, disempowering. Now that the continent chose to build its own road, the world called it dangerous. And still, the adoption spread. From Lusophone Angola to Arabic-speaking Sudan, the protocols adapted. Developers localized platforms overnight. Startups thrived on open access. Government ministries issued guidelines to ensure connectivity for schools, hospitals, and public services. Across borders, cooperation, not dependency, became the new logic. This was not a cyber rebellion. It was a continental reset. But no reset goes unchallenged. Behind closed doors, corporations began pressuring partner governments to block access. Rumors swirled of trade repercussions, contract terminations, and conditional aid packages being reconsidered. But the pressure, though heavy, came too late. The people had already chosen. And in a moment that captured the mood, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a crowd in Ouagadougou and said simply, "Dependence ends the day we decide it ends." The words went viral, not because they were provocative, but because they felt like truth carved from stone. A continent that had long been seen as a user of tools was now shaping its own. Not everyone welcomed the change. Not everyone believed it would last. But belief had already spread faster than fiber, deeper than code. And in its wake came something even more powerful than speed or bandwidth. Dignity. Because what the world missed was that this was never about bandwidth. It was about belonging. And the next test of governance, resilience, and unity was already on its way. A revolution is not real until it touches the ordinary. And this one did. Quietly, profoundly, and in places the world rarely looks. In a small village outside Bobo Dioulasso, a farmer opens an app designed not in California, but in Ouagadougou. It tells him when the rain will come, how to price his crops, and where buyers are waiting. Without charging a cent in hidden fees. In Nairobi, a teenage girl streams her secondary school lessons in Swahili, with no buffering, no interruptions, no threat of data cuts. Her mother no longer chooses between groceries and internet top-ups. This is what sovereignty looks like when made visible. For decades, African families paid a silent tax on connectivity, not through legislation, but through the structure of the internet itself. Every megabyte routed across continents. Every transaction sliced by foreign tolls. The cost wasn't just monetary, it was cognitive, emotional, cultural. The message was clear. Your knowledge lives elsewhere. Your voice, your story, your value, delivered back to you at a premium. That model is now broken. The change swept faster than predicted. Hospitals in Lusaka now share diagnostic images through regional servers. Civil servants in Ghana process digital documents without relying on platforms built by distant engineers. Banks in Dakar update interest rates across branches in milliseconds, without detouring through Europe. Across the continent, the economic logic has shifted. Instead of exporting digital wealth and importing services, Africa now circulates its own. The $50 billion once drained annually for outsourced digital services now fuels local economies. Engineers, data scientists, network technicians, no longer emigrating, but building. Startups receive funding not just from global venture capitalists, but from public-private partnerships rooted in sovereign goals. What once was extraction is now regeneration. But the impact is not only economic, it is psychological. Students search for Malian empire and find pages in Bambara, Wolof, and French, written by African scholars, illustrated with African maps. The algorithm no longer flattens their history. It amplifies it. The internet, once a mirror reflecting foreign narratives, becomes a canvas for local memory. And that shift breeds pride. In markets and schools, on social media and murals, the new internet is not just infrastructure, it's identity. But freedom is never given freely. It must be protected. The rise of sovereign infrastructure brought a challenge to civil society. With control of cables and servers came responsibility. Activists raised urgent questions. Who governs this new internet? Who ensures access is equal? That surveillance doesn't creep in under new flags? In Accra, youth leaders demanded open audits of data centers. In Maputo, NGOs held forums to draft a continental digital bill of rights. In Johannesburg, journalists called for safeguards to ensure search engines don't favor political power over public interest. These were not interruptions. They were evolutions. Because sovereignty without accountability is simply another form of dependence. Governments that once blamed Silicon Valley for censorship or bias now face their own mirrors. The pressure to maintain transparency grows not from outside, but from within. The people who built this system are also its watchdogs, and that is its strength. Across ministries, parliaments, and universities, the conversation has shifted. It's no longer about catching up. It's about leading, setting norms, and asking, how can digital life reflect not just efficiency, but dignity? In this context, headlines bearing Ibrahim Traoré news are no longer limited to politics or conflict. They speak of digital schools in Burkina Faso, local tech conferences with continental reach, youth summits quoting his call for sovereignty from the soil to the server. The man who once shocked the world by rejecting foreign military alliances is now celebrated for connecting rural schools to cloud classrooms. And yet, there are tensions. Regional inequalities remain. Urban centers surged ahead, while remote areas waited. Tech literacy divides persist. Language localization is a constant battle. The structure is sovereign, but the struggle continues. Still, something fundamental has changed: the sense of agency. For the first time in modern memory, African nations are not waiting to be connected. They are choosing how they connect, where their data lives, whose values guide their code. And this choice is rippling outward. In the past, dependence meant silence. Now, independence means dialogue. Civil society doesn't just react. They design, critique, and rebuild. A continent long treated as a market has become a maker. But the world is watching. And some are wondering, if Africa no longer asks for digital inclusion, but defines it, what happens to the old order? At first, the world dismissed it as symbolic, a gesture, a headline. But when the switch flipped and the numbers surged, the international reaction changed. In Addis Ababa, the African Union moved quickly. What began as a national initiative became a continental framework. The AU announced a formal endorsement of the new digital protocol, calling it a landmark step towards African sovereignty in the information age. ECOWAS followed suit, launching a task force to integrate cross-border data policies. Regional blocs from North to Southern Africa echoed the sentiment. This was no longer an experiment. It was the foundation of something enduring. Outside the continent, however, the tone was different. In Brussels, EU commissioners expressed concern over technical compatibility and potential risks to cybersecurity standards. In diplomatic briefings, words like splintering and data sovereignty conflict began to surface. Paris held closed-door discussions about digital influence in Francophone West Africa. London debated whether it was losing not just market share, but narrative control. Washington, meanwhile, found itself torn. On one hand, the United States had long advocated for internet freedom. On the other, its corporate giants, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, had just lost access to hundreds of millions of users. Tech lobbyists warned of a dangerous precedent. Think tanks warned of fragmentation. Policymakers hesitated. Should they push back? Should they negotiate? Or should they accept that the digital world was no longer unipolar? The fear wasn't just about technology. It was about a shift in power. Soft power, market power, epistemic power. The algorithms that once shaped global knowledge flows were being outcoded, outrouted, outlocalized. In Silicon Valley, engineers admitted privately, the new protocol was brilliant in its simplicity and brutal in its efficiency. We didn't just lose a region, one said. We lost a framework. But while some saw danger, others saw direction. In South America, ministers referenced Africa's model in public speeches, exploring their own continental backbone. In Asia, regional networks were already forming, inspired by the African blueprint. Even in the Pacific, islands once digitally isolated began asking whether Africa's solution could be scaled for them. This was not digital isolation. It was rebalancing, a multipolar internet, a set of parallel ecosystems. Sovereign, decentralized, rooted in local governance and cultural context. For some, it felt like a threat to the global order. For others, it felt like justice long delayed. And somewhere between fear and admiration, a question began to surface across boardrooms, foreign ministries, and university campuses. If Africa can build this, what else might it reclaim? The answer, it seemed, was coming. But first, the continent had to confront its next frontier, sustaining freedom without falling into new dependencies. Every revolution faces its dawn, and now Africa stands at that horizon. Not in celebration, but in preparation. The hardest work, always, begins after the applause fades. Building infrastructure is one thing. Defending the principles that built it is another. The first challenge is resilience. Can the cables endure? Can local teams manage network loads, fend off cyber threats, and maintain cross-border synchronization without falling back into foreign outsourcing? Engineers are optimistic, but realism prevails. Sovereignty, they say, must be tested daily. The second challenge is governance. Who owns the data? Who protects user rights? Will leaders resist the temptation to replace foreign control with domestic censorship? Civil society is watching. So are educators, journalists, and the tech community. The third challenge is solidarity. Will the continent move together or fracture again into digital islands? The strength of this system lies not only in code, but in cooperation. Shared standards, language integration, pooled security, collective maintenance. Already, task forces are drafting long-term strategies. Universities are building new IT curricula rooted in sovereignty. Governments are investing in cloud resilience, power backups, and local manufacturing of digital components. There is talk of satellites, of open-source protocols, made in Africa, for Africa, and perhaps one day, for the world. But the greatest test is not technical. It is moral. Can Africa resist the return of the old logic? Dependency dressed in new offers, investment tied to control. Partnerships that ask for silence in return for service. This is where discipline must outlast defiance. Sovereignty is not a speech. It is a posture, a practice, a refusal to trade short-term convenience for long-term compromise. And yet, the moment is fertile. What once seemed too bold now seems inevitable. The question is not whether digital independence is possible, but whether it can become permanent. Across the continent, signs of commitment are taking root. Local app stores gaining traction, tech incubators running on open African stacks, cross-border data deals written in local languages. Even school children now learn coding not in abstract terms, but through localized tools, shaped by their culture, their geography, their voice. This is not just capacity, it is character, and it will determine whether this revolution ends in spectacle or legacy. Because the road ahead is not just about resisting external pressure. It is about avoiding internal complacency. The dream must be renewed every day, not with slogans, but with systems. Not with speeches, but with servers. And the final turn is near, not an ending, but a test. Will this new Africa prove that sovereignty can scale, that dignity can be coded, that freedom once claimed can be protected by choice, by design, by unity? The answer lies just beyond the next update, the next connection, the next decision. This was never just a story about internet cables. It was about who gets to write the code of the future. For generations, Africa was told to follow, to wait, to receive, to adapt. But with one switch, that narrative cracked. No longer the tenant, the continent became the architect. It did not beg for bandwidth. It built its own. And in doing so, it reframed the most fundamental question of the modern age. Who decides what sovereignty looks like? The journey has only begun. There are still bugs to fix, roads to pave, and voices to amplify. But one truth now stands unshaken. Freedom is not given. It is chosen, built, defended, from gold in the soil to signals in the sky. Africa is claiming more than resources. It is claiming its reflection, its voice, its rhythm. When people search for Ibrahim Traoré news today, they do not only find politics or protest, they find fiber maps, data centers, school networks, farmers online, coders in hubs from Ouagadougou to Lagos. What began as one leader's defiant vision is now the daily reality of millions. A second result appears too. Another headline under the same search. Africa's digital future leads the world in decentralized design. This is not a fantasy. This is not charity. This is sovereignty. For those watching from afar, in New York, Sao Paulo, Jakarta, Marseille, this moment is not only African, it is universal, because the structures that once dictated global connectivity are cracking, and what replaces them will shape how truth, culture, and power move for generations to come. Ibrahim Traoré news is no longer just about Burkina Faso. It is about a global shift, a call to rethink dependence, to question inherited systems, to believe that dignity can be hardwired. So we ask you, those watching, reading, reflecting, what kind of world do you want your children to log into? One where knowledge flows outward for profit, or inward for empowerment? One where dignity is rented or rooted? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Speak of it, share it. Let it reach places cables haven't yet touched. And if you wish to walk with us through the next chapter of hope, sovereignty, and transformation, subscribe, not for content, for connection.